Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Joe Hagan. I'm chairman of the Board of Trustees of John Cabot University. I certainly welcome this conference to our university and so happy that we are collaborating with it. I'm sort of a substitute this morning because the president, Franco Pavancello, who some of you met last night at the reception, is now in Washington on a variety of missions. And since I was here for a meeting of the Board of Trustees and a few other things, he asked me if I would welcome you formally on behalf of the university. This is a very exciting program, The Rise of Data-Driven Economy, Implications for Growth and Policy. I won't talk about that so much this morning as just to say a few words with respect to John Cabot University, who we are and what our mission is. 40 years ago, and this is the 40th anniversary of the university, so we're in a celebratory mood here, a group of American businessmen decided that we needed an American university here in Rome. It was a very ambitious project. They worked with some educators and set up a program which would be principally a study abroad program. Students from the various American universities would send their students for a year or two, the traditional junior year program, although it was not confined to the junior year, so they could experience Rome and experience the international community. They started out with less than 200 students. Very, very small number. We were able to attract some wonderful professors from all over, people who in the United States, of course, would do very well, but who preferred to live in Rome, to live in Europe, and who were satisfied and happy, really maybe to take a little bit less than they would in America in order to be here in an international environment. We grew slowly. And we grew precipitously because the numbers would go up and down, and we had financial issues for a long time. But we developed a very solid academic program. And today, 40 years after the founding, about 190 students or so, we are now 1,200 students from 40 countries throughout the world. We have a continued study abroad program with many, many universities in the United States and throughout the world. But also, we have our own degree program. And about half of our students are working for degrees here, degrees in the liberal arts and degrees in various business areas. And there's a great harmony among all these students and all these professors. One example of that is I was talking the other day to the president of the student body, a lovely woman from Kosovo. And I said, how do you get along with your vice president, Felipe? And she says, very well. I said, well, Felipe is a Serbian, isn't he? And she said, yeah, but we get along just great. So in other words, the problems that we see on the international scene don't seem to be here at this university for some reason or another. These students work so well together. You know, we were talking yesterday about reasoning together, sitting down, trying to be non-ideological. And when I was speaking with a student yesterday, and I guess I was being somewhat ideological. I said, well, you know, Mark, you can't think that way. He says, well, you know, he says, Chairman, he said, it's not so much the ideology of it, it's what works. And I thought that was very surprising and encouraging, because that's the way we try to approach things here. I'm delighted that my old friend and colleague Bernie McKay has been so instrumental in arranging for this conference. Bernie and I go way, way, way back to the days in Washington of Senator Claiborne Pell and Congressman John Fogerty and people like that, who were really on the cutting edge of some of the important things that we are doing today. I think Bernie is a very, very resourceful person, as you all know, but he's also vice chairman of the Board of Trustees here at this college. He's had 3 students of his own, 3 of his own children have attended in one way or another John Cabot. So I'm very happy that Bernie is here today, and we're really at the cutting edge today of a wonderful, wonderful growth in this institution, which I think from one small building over on the Via Massawa has now become 3 or 4 buildings here in Trastevere. People say, where is your campus? I say, look around. It's really a marvelous situation. So thank you for coming. Welcome. And I hope we'll see you again here in Rome. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm Will Marshall, President of the Progressive Policy Institute, knocking your name tag off. Yes. I want to welcome you all here today to this conference on the rise of the data-driven economy, and to thank, first off, the Chairman and John Cabot University for being our host and partner in this really interesting event. As Dr. Hagan has said, Bernie McKay, who's also on the board of John Cabot, is a great friend and supporter of PPI and me personally. And it was really Bernie who put me and Franco Pavancello together to talk about a collaboration along these lines. And we just thought that culturally, what you said is right. There's a good fit between PPI, which has been a think tank in Washington devoted to radically pragmatic reform, and John Cabot University, a great American university in Rome. So we're just thrilled to be here. Rome's laid on some wonderful weather for us, and really want to thank you for hosting us and all the great team that's made this possible. Because we're a relatively small think tank in Washington, it's not easy putting on an event in Rome. We've partnered with a lot of folks, and I want to thank the Guarini Institute, and particularly the European Privacy Institute with Pietro Paganini, who has just provided all sorts of help, which we deeply appreciate, and also Pablo Compostello of APCO, who's been great and will probably be here later. All right, so why are we here? Why is PPI, a think tank based in Washington, here in Rome? Why did we leave the United States in the midst of a thrilling, extremely close contest, or really series of contests? And I refer, of course, to the baseball playoffs. But we do have a pretty important presidential election happening also, and at the center of that election is really the question of how to revive America's economic dynamism. There is a terrible fear in the country that it has slipped, that the country is in economic decline. President Obama has said that's not true, but that's sort of what this campaign is about. Which party has the best ideas for reviving America's economy, expanding our productive base, making us more competitive again, and generating more middle-class jobs to reverse the decline toward the trend toward inequality that's been so evident in the United States. And to us, a large part of the answer, not the whole of it, but comes down to this phenomenon of the data-driven economy, which Dr. Michael Mandel, our chief economic strategist, has really been a groundbreaking student of this phenomenon. The communications boom in the United States is the economic success story we have to tell now. It's the leading edge of economic growth in the United States, of innovation, highly competitive and dynamic industry. We wish we had more of them, but it is important to us to draw attention to this phenomenon because we believe that the explosive growth of the data-driven economy is just beginning. I mean, we've seen, the velocity of these changes is extraordinary. We've seen big data become a huge industry in just the last decade. We've seen Facebook go to 1 billion users here. As Michael has chronicled, the rise of the app economy, 500,000 jobs in the United States just since the introduction of the smartphone. So powerful forces are at work here, and we want to think about how we can work with our friends in Europe and elsewhere to make sure that we are protecting a robust ecosystem for innovation. We think that ought to be at the center of the transatlantic dialogue. For years, I've been coming over here to talk about security issues, which used to be what Europeans and Americans got together most often to talk about. But I really do believe that we have a common challenge in reviving employment and competitiveness on both sides of the Atlantic, particularly in Europe as well, with unemployment over, 11% Europe-wide. And so we see this as a common challenge facing both the United States and Europe, and it's a source of comparative advantage to our economies, our ability to innovate, our ability to unleash more data-driven activity, which, as Michael Mandel has pointed out in his work, is really a wholly different category of economic activity, something that we don't even know how to measure properly. We're not even capturing its real contributions to growth. So that's why we're here. We want to talk about what we think is the most important issue facing our societies, which is economic revival, and the role that innovation-based growth plays in that, and particularly the rise of a data-driven economy. We're running a little late, so I just want to end by thanking all the people who have come. We have tremendous representation from companies, particularly from the United States, innovation companies, the kind of companies who have created this innovation ecosystem. And we have great representation from our friends in Europe and also from the European Commission and the Parliament. We're very happy to have official representation here. We'll have the American Embassy heard from later today, but we've put together, I think, a really dynamic and diverse group of people to help us deconstruct what are the chief obstacles to data-driven growth. Concerns about data protection, or as we still call it in the United States, privacy rules. And that's not the term of art here, but we think there's considerable consternation in the United States, particularly about the possibility that clashing data protection paradigms will put up undue barriers to the free cross-border flow of information and data. And we want to talk about the kind of issues that are going to be on the agenda at the WICET meeting in December in Doha, with many countries, sort of trying to offer alternatives to the decentralized, multi-stakeholder approach to internet governance, which we think has been critical. It's critical to the development of the internet. And we want to talk particularly about the responsibilities of private companies to build trust with their customers, to handle customers' data responsibly, and to engage in what our friends at Intuit call responsible and ethical data stewardship, which we think is absolutely imperative if we're going to obviate the most intrusive kinds of regulation. So, we'll talk about all those. We're also going to take a little detour tomorrow morning to hear from Dr. Thierry Vissol on the Eurozone crisis and get a quick update on that, which I think will be interesting, particularly to the Americans here today. So thank you all for coming from various points of the compass to this important transatlantic dialogue. And at this stage, I think we should just get going. I want to turn things over to Rita Balog, who will moderate our first session.
Thank you very much, Bill. My name is Rita Balogh. I'm a senior associate at APCO Worldwide. It is a global public affairs consultancy, and I'm leading the work of the company on data protection in Europe. I'm based in Brussels, so I do follow very closely what's going on in Brussels with the revision of the European legislation and EU data protection framework. And I guess nowadays the reason for people from the US and Europe to get together is not security anymore, or just not only security, but really data protection, and to see how we can combine and find common grounds of these different approaches of sector regulation, co-regulation, versus a horizontal legislation that is, to be honest, tend to be a little bit more prescriptive than what we have in the United States. So I have 4 panelists today. Let me start from the right. Mr. Roberto Masiero, Mr. Michael Mandel, Mr. Jaques Bughin, and Anthony House from Google. You have the brochure and the bios of everybody in the little booklet that was distributed. However, I cannot really resist the temptation to say a few words about my speakers. So Mr. Mandel on my left is the Chief Economic Strategist at PPI. He's also a fellow at the University of Pennsylvania, the Wharton School Mark Center for Technology Innovation. He used to work for Business Week for many, many years, and he received several awards, including the honor of being selected to be one of the top 100 US journalists for the 20th century. He published several articles. One of them was also distributed to you, and I really encourage everybody to read it. It's very interesting, though I think we're going to hear a few words about this study beyond goods and services. On my right-hand side is Mr. Masiero, who is the president of Think. This is an innovation knowledge foundation which is based in Italy, but you also work in several European countries and emerging markets. He used to work for International Data Corporation, IDC, which is the leading worldwide ICT market research company, and you can see many studies from ICT on the economic impact of various companies and various sectors, which is highly interesting as well. Then you can see Jaques Bughin, who is the director of the Brussels office of McKinsey Global Institute. He's also a fellow at various think tanks and universities, including the Aspen Institute, the ECHOR, the Catholic University of Leuven, as well as the European Institute of Business Administration. And you can see his name in many articles in various international academic journals. And last but not least, our industry representative, Anthony, who is heading Google's public policy strategy team for Europe, Middle East, and Africa. He joined Google in 2006 and has been working on various issues, of course, most of all data protection, but also on click fraud, executive communication, the Android operating system. As well said, I will ask my speaker to give a brief introduction of about 10 minutes. We have normally an hour and a half for the panel, and I do encourage everybody to ask questions after the presentation, and I do encourage my speakers to stick to the 10 minutes so we can open the floor for questions. So please, Mr. Mandel, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. The developed countries face three crises. By developed countries, of course, I mean Europe, the US, Japan. One crisis is economic, the lack of jobs, the lack of growth. One crisis is demographic, young versus old. And the third crisis is a crisis of governance, our inability to actually take the steps that we need to take. There's two responses to these crises. One response is to retreat, to back up, to protect. The second response is to embrace, move forward, innovate. Much of what's going on today in the world can be thought of in this lens. We know that we have these crises, and we're battling over whether or not to move forward or fall back. What we're talking about today is we're talking about how these three crises intersect with this technological change, the shift to the data-driven economy. Now, if you think about it, we've seen these shifts before. We saw the shift to the industrial economy, the shift from the industrial economy to the service economy, and now the shift to the data-driven economy. Our goal is to understand how to encourage this transition while still helping the most vulnerable among us. Because we didn't get to where we were today by falling back, by retreating. We have to understand that this fight between the people who want to protect the past and the people who want to embrace the future is going on in many battlegrounds. And what we're talking about today, a lot of the policy issues, is part of this larger battle. The larger battle about whether or not we're going to deal with our various crises by hunkering down and hiding, or whether we're going to deal with these crises by pushing forward into the future. That's kind of the larger framework of the conference today, and it's a larger framework, a lot of these discussions. You know, you can take it down to the small, which is questions of data protection and data policy, or you can understand this as part of a larger battle, which will involve a new way of thinking about the economy, a new way of thinking about our demographic problems, and a new way of thinking about how we govern ourselves, which is really scary for a lot of people. The Progressive Policy Institute, where I have, when did I affiliate myself with PPI? It's like two and a half years at this point. Okay. Can be summed up, what we do is pragmatic policy backed up by facts. And let me just give you a few facts. In the US, the internet industry, internet publishing, internet broadcasting, search, social media, is the fastest growing industry in terms of employment over the last 4 years, with a 44% gain in jobs. As Will mentioned, there are more than 500,000 app economy jobs in the US today. These are jobs that use app economy skills. And a third fact is that in the US, personal consumption of data is adding more than 0.5 percentage point to GDP growth. Now, this may not seem like a very big number, but in Europe, if personal consumption of data would boost GDP growth by 0.5 percentage point, over 10 years, that would amount to 5% of GDP, or more than $100 billion. Big stuff. These facts, and more facts like them, are potent arguments in the policy debate. Because as I mentioned, what you have is this debate between the people who want to stand back and the people who want to move forward. And what's essential is to convince the people who are scared of the future that there's something in it for them. In terms of jobs, in terms of growth, in terms of a resolution of some of these crises that so bedevil us. Now, one of the things that we've done at PPI is develop new methodologies for thinking about the data-driven economy. So there's a paper that just came out at the back of the room last week called Beyond Goods and Services, the Unmeasured Rise of the Data-Driven Economy. Very important, because right now what people do is they measure the economy in ways that don't pick up the real growth that's going on. If you look at the development of economic statistics, you go back to the 1800s. And what we had then was we had the ability to start measuring finally goods like locomotives, hard, solid goods that you could count. We didn't have the concept of GDP, gross domestic product, economic growth, until the 1930s. At that point, we were starting to develop the ability to measure services, retailing, accounting, finance. And now what's happening in the 21st century, we have to be able to measure the growth that's happening in the data-driven parts of the economy. Because if we can't measure that, you can't actually make the argument that what we're doing is beneficial. Now, data is much different than either goods or services. If you think about it, goods are tangible and can be stored. Services are intangible, but they can't be stored. Data partakes of the quality of both goods and services. Data is intangible, but it can be stored. It can be improved. It can be traded. It is something that is real. It doesn't exist simply as a shadow for the rest of the economy. Data at some point has the ability to address our crises, our economic, demographic, and governance crises. We'll end up with, I'm going to skip ahead to the governance because that's really interesting. We will end up with different forms of governance than we have today. The types of governance that we have, both political and also in corporate, were based in a world in which we had much more cruder methods of communication. We had much cruder messages of actually figuring out what we could control and what we couldn't. The transition to the data-driven economy is not just about economics and jobs, it's about the way that our society is put together. Yes? 1 minute. We are going to have a new arithmetic. The new arithmetic is not just adding up goods, it's not just adding up services, but it's adding up data, new sources of growth, new ways of dealing with the demographic divide, and new ways of governing. These are both very powerful and very scary. And I know that the panelists later today and tomorrow are going to address a lot of these issues. But what is important to understand is that what's driving a lot of our policy debates about data protection, is these larger issues about the way that we're going to move forward into the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I guess the first question is, if we could measure the economic impact of data, one segment that we don't really think about right now is the concept of big data. And I know there is quite a lot of work going on in the World Economic Forum. There are increasingly conferences around this theme in Brussels as well, but I didn't have the impression that this concept of big data has been integrated. For example, when the Commission proposal on data protection was put forward, there are concepts like data minimization, there are concepts of informed consent, prior consent, which don't necessarily fit with a secondary use of the data, which don't necessarily fit with this new concept of big data. And I guess if we could measure somehow the economic impact of this, it would be really interesting to put that forward to decision makers as well, to see what is the economic impact of regulating these what we call big data, and what are the downsides of that. So I guess Jaques will demonstrate talk about what this big data is about and what is the economic impact of big data.
Thank you, Rita. I have a presentation. I don't think I'm going to have the time to go to it. Let me just explain what I would like to do with you. First, I'm quite sure you know what McKinsey is. McKinsey is actually two things. One is the McKinsey Global Institute, when I'm a leader of, where we look at problems or issues or opportunities like big data from a global perspective and try to understand how big these phenomena are and how they will drive economic growth. And on the other side, I'm serving clients. So I've got the virtue of taking a second lens, and the second lens is to see what's actually happening inside companies. And I can obviously reconcile both the microeconomic view of the top-down with the bottom-up of the companies. Now, why is this interesting? Because McKinsey has been working quite extensively about the topic of big data. And again, I can give you a lot of numbers that looks big. I can, for instance, referring to Anthony's employer, Google, pretty much 12 to 15 trillion of searches by Google annually. If you look at the global number of exabytes and terabytes of data, that's just a huge amount, and there is 40% growth. And as Michael was saying, if we try to estimate the needs for people who will be able to track, compile, use, create insight from data, we estimate that it's about 150,000 purely data analytical people that will be needed in the US alone. So these numbers are all known, but I would like to go one step further, which is, if this input is now, what about the output? What are people doing with this data? Do we see actually what Michael was saying, which is, do we see transformation, and transformation that leads to growth? And obviously, what drives that? Is it purely growth, or is it driven at the level of the bottom up by a competitiveness element, i.e. companies who are reaping the benefit of this data potential and are creating new business models, are the ones that basically create the growth? Here are the few facts that I want to basically put on the table, and then we can discuss. Now, if I go back to number one, which is the company's view, the fundamental point is, working with a lot of companies, most of the companies today don't realize the value of data. They understand intuitively the data are sitting there. There's just a lot of public data available. You can mash them up. They are private data. But the fundamental thing that we see is that there is a very long tail of performance when it comes to using this data for performance growth, i.e. one company out of 10 know how to use data and basically be able to develop something out of that. Surprisingly, when I go to clients, the first thing I do most of the time is not to state something. I basically plug my computer, I go on Google search for insight, I simply map the company searches, and I just compare them with their competitors. And I go deep dive into how many overlaps of branded search do you have between two companies to estimate, for instance, how the brand of one client basically overlap and competes. People have no insight about on this data. Nobody get a view that the consumer today basically is talking a lot about themselves. And the point I want to make is that, first of all, a lot of companies don't have yet the capabilities to extract this data, and two, they don't have business model to basically exploit this data. Now, obviously, we all know people like Walmart, obviously the Google of these words, obviously companies that are using this data in such a way that they are extremely productive. And the point is very simple. If you compare companies like Walmart, like Google, like an Amazon or all the internet companies, fact is today that if you look at the labor productivity, i.e. the output delivered by the number of employees, they tend to be 5 to 10 times better in terms of labor productivity and labor productivity growth than the rest, which seems to suggest that there is a lot of insight from using data. So the first point I want to make is that companies today don't get a very good view about what data they could use, let alone they don't have the capabilities in-house to explore this data. Let me give you a second example as an economist. I did my PhD thesis in macroeconomics, and at that time I had to estimate some interesting economic models for Belgium, for that matter. And at that time, the data that I was using to forecast the Belgian economy was based on a time series of annual data points for 30 years. 30 years, 30 points. So as you know, in statistics, 30 data points give you a convergence to the law of large numbers and give you a few insight. But the point is that the theory of economics tells you, as a social science, if you only have 30 data points, you always try to minimize a risk that you infer something which is wrong. The beauty of data, if I want to estimate now the economic growth of different companies or different countries, I now have so many types of data that I can actually do experiments, not on 30 data points, but possibly about 30,000 data points, which means that I can replicate and know the risk is not to say something which is wrong, but to try to finally find something which is right, simply because I've got much more data. So the paradigm is moving from a paradigm of let's not try to say something if we don't have evidence, from paradigms of experimentation where we can find much more evidence. In a company, if you can find experiments where you can subsegment your customer base and find out that Mr. X prefer this type of product versus Mr. Y, and you can subsegment at that level, and you can try and experiment, obviously, that's new business opportunities. So that's the second point. The second point is that those data change not only how you use it, but also the paradigm of using it. Big data changed the paradigm of using data from a paradigm of scarcity and careful of stating versus a paradigm of experiment and try out. It's about finding and not about trying not to discover. It's a process of discovering. And all these companies I'm talking to, obviously, are doing that. Again, if you take the example of Walmart, Walmart experiments pretty much 10,000 times a day on its website the type of allocation of products that will be shown to you in the front page. If you go on the Google page, obviously, every 10 seconds, I guess there will be something like 1,000 to 10,000 changes that you don't see on the page as a way to create new experimentation. So again, the point is the business paradigm is changing. Third thing, it's not only about paradigm, and that's the third element of the input from the firm perspective. It's all about organization. An organization today which does not understand data will still be confined with the old paradigm of organization, which is pretty much IT drives the data, IT is separate from marketing, marketing is a user of data, and needs always to ask to get product development, and IT will decide whether it's got enough resource to do it. Now, if you look at the big data today, big data is moving to the cloud. Big data is not moving to IT, but it's actually moving back directly into marketing. Why? Because the interface that we have, for instance, on Facebook and Google, are directly information that you can share that could be residing directly into marketing. So the third thing, which is quite important, companies that are understanding data are dramatically changing the way they organize themselves simply to be seamlessly organized to make sure that they can use and get something out of the data that they can get. That's the micro view. Now you can tell me, what's the evidence of that? The evidence of that is that in the average case, companies using these three things tend to grow roughly twice as fast as the other when we control for size, sector, and all that. Two, productivity itself tend to be 10 to 50, up to 100% better than the average company in each of the sector. That's the evidence. Is this evidence means it's all about redistribution of market share and profits? Is it leading to macroeconomic growth? Because if I take the money out of the money of somebody else as just competition, there is not a lot of added value added. Now the point is that here's the macroeconomic evidence. In fact, the beauty of big data is that big data is not necessarily private, it's usually a public good. I can easily mash up data today, and you can do it by using tools like Google Search, by using social mention as a public entity that mash up every type of conversation happening on Facebook or whatever social media that you want. And this public good you can use. And here's the macroeconomic evidence. And it converges to Michael's point. We try for the first time to measure what we call the big data digital capital. The digital capital is composed of two things. Tangible, the infrastructure that allows the internet to work, servers, routers, backbone, and so on. And then there is all the intangible in terms of services, in terms of digital capabilities and competence, in terms of some IP rights that you need to basically develop some application like in the mobile and the like. We have done that. And here are three striking statistics. If you measure the digital capital today, this is roughly as a stock, about 4 trillion of US dollars of stock linked to the digital capital, staggering amount. Two, if you take that in terms of capital expense, not as a measure of stock, but capital expense, it's roughly today 10 to 15% of the total capital of the global economy. But the third point is the most striking fact. This 10% of capital makes 50% of the capital productivity in the economy. The 10% makes the 50% of the capital productivity. We estimate today that this digital capital pretty much, and close to Michael's numbers with a different methodology, gives 60 basis points of growth to economies, and roughly up to 1 point of growth in a market like the US. So roughly 50% of the GDP growth that happened in 2011 comes from big data. I will stop here and say there is evidence that companies are trying and mastering big data, but there's still a long way to go. And despite that, we see the capital is already a big drivers of growth. Imagine when the two together are starting to work, i.e. all the companies are finally doing digital capital correctly. Now, 2 words of caution, and I stop there. The problem of digital capital, as we look at that, is again a new digital divide, i.e. companies like the US, like the UK, like Israel and the like, are actually mastering much better digital capital. No wonder. These are the countries where it's easier to do these kind of businesses. That's where the innovation in terms of internet companies is happening. And what we see is that they start to grow, linked to digital capital, much faster than the developing countries. So again, we are recreating not a convergence of growth, but again, a separation and basically a dichotomy of growth again in the economy. Second thing, what is the second digital divide? The second digital divide is not about capital. Capital will flow. The question is about labor and skilled labor. And today, it's important to notice that skilled capital is also a new digital divide. Skilled capital in terms of analytics competencies and all that start to happen much more in the US. It's lagging behind in Europe, and it's starting actually to pick up in developing countries, not like India, like China, but even Africa, because they have a potential to blow back or to catch up on the public infrastructure to develop. So I'll leave you with that. A promising big data is happening, economy is happening, but 2 digital divide, one where the growth is again with the usual suspect, and one where it's all about human capital and human skilled capital linked to analytics and data center economy. Thank you.
Thank you, Jaques. I guess the key to unlocking the potential of big data is then experiment. So I think one of the questions, maybe if I can do that for the next panel, is how do you create an environment for data protection that would actually encourage this experiment rather than, you know, stopping companies for fear of compliance risk of not experimenting and innovating in this field. I guess it would be really interesting to hear what a company who's actually working with big data every day thinks about what we heard.
Thank you. My name is Anthony House. I lead Google's policy strategy team, but for the past 3 years, I've also worn a data protection hat. I'm increasingly thinking more about this side of things, the opportunities in data, the opportunities in knowledge distribution, but I still do quite a lot of privacy and data protection work as well. I was really happy to receive and accept the invitation to speak on this panel because Google has a lot of respect for the work that the PPI does. The data-driven and pragmatic policy approach is one that we try to take ourselves, certainly internally, but also on our public policy team. Google is a very data-driven company. Michael already mentioned that in the US, the internet industry is by far the fastest growing sector of the economy, although there seemed to be slight disagreement between Michael and Jaques on the exact number of basis points that big data.
It's so close.
It is. I know. I was amazed. Somewhere between 50 and 60 basis points, but with differing methodologies. So that's encouraging. When I joined Google's privacy team, I sort of was the odd man out because I'm not a lawyer and I'm not an engineer, and we have lots of technical people and lots of legal people on the privacy team, and I'm a historian. And I was saying earlier to Rita that the way I have retrospectively adjusted my education is to say that I've always been interested in the unintended consequences of policy decisions. Normally in slightly more arcane, less practical ways. My master's thesis was on the reform of English marriage law in 1753, and my doctorate was on the redistribution of church land after the English Reformation and the implications of English property law on that. So of course the natural place for me to end up would be Google and Google's public policy team. With my strategy hat on, when I go to meet policymakers, surprisingly, even though I'm on the privacy team, surprisingly the question I get most often is, how do we build a Silicon X? Whether in the UK that's Silicon Roundabout, whether in Manhattan it's the Silicon Alley. But just about every country asks us what they can do to drive innovation. And that's actually been quite a nice opportunity, it sparked quite a nice opportunity within Google to think more broadly about our policy positions. So obviously, when there are laws that are going to specifically affect us, we take positions on those. But we also have taken an opportunity to come up with answers when people ask us that question about how do I build a Silicon Valley in my country. We published a white paper about it in July, I think, and I think it's the title of it is Innovation Stimulus, and you can certainly look it up. I'm going to go through a couple of the points in that white paper, just as a teaser. There are sort of 5 pillars that we discuss. Only one of them is really about regulation of the private sector, and that's creating opportunities for growth. The other 4 are reforming the public sector, investing in human capital, optimizing existing infrastructure, and building tomorrow's innovation through research and development. But I wanted to go through a couple of the specific policy proposals that we make in that document. They're not all about how governments or policymakers can make the most of the data-driven economy. So I'm just going to focus on the ones that do. But the thing that ties them together is they try to look for what are the key qualities that have enabled the internet to be such a successful enabler of business, and how can we apply those more broadly to society, to governance, to different economic sectors. One statistic that hasn't been mentioned yet, but that came out of a report that we worked on with McKinsey in 2011, was that among SMEs, 75% of the economic impact of the internet comes from traditional companies, not from companies that would describe themselves as internet players. And so there is a lot of potential to sort of apply the efficiencies of the internet to other areas. One of the pillars of our innovation stimulus proposal or set of ideas is reforming the public sector, and the key here for us is ensuring that public sector information is open and accessible. Korea is actually doing quite well in this. They're probably the undisputed leader globally in public procurement moving online. They implemented a system that requires annual investment that's in the millions of dollars, but saves over $6 billion for government. And participating suppliers have estimated that they save $50 billion in annual procurement activity as a result. The specific proposal is that open public data, since it can provide infrastructure for entrepreneurs and citizens, creates a market for building new civic services. We estimate that requiring public sector information to be made open and accessible would, in Europe alone, would save between 140 and 180 billion euros annually. And given the current economic climate, when public sector organization, the public sector in particular is being expected to create the same outputs with fewer resources, we think that this is a pretty obvious opportunity that can be taken advantage of. Similarly, we think that we should require the open licensing of publicly funded education resources. This is an idea that didn't originate with Google. It's been around for a while. But the internet provides an opportunity for everyone to have access to a high-quality education. And part of the way that that can be made economically feasible is by building into the public grant system a requirement that the results of that research be made publicly available. Perhaps more controversial, especially when I look at it through my data protection lens, is a set of recommendations on optimizing the existing infrastructure. This includes recommendations to do things like promote real-time access to energy data for consumers, which has been, has a lot of potential, but also has seen a lot of controversy, particularly in the European Union. One thing that Google has been involved in for several years is promoting the measurement of internet effectiveness, the internet speed and cost in various places around the world. We are one of the core partners in a group called the Measurement Lab. And if you haven't looked at their work, you certainly should do. It's an open research architecture that now has something on the order of 5 terabytes of openly available data on connection speeds and internet robustness from individual contributors around the world. And it tells us not only about the effectiveness of the network in individual countries, but also the places where it can tell us a lot, not just about the connection speed, but also about the business potential and the potential for the internet to contribute to other sectors of the economy. And I guess the final one that I would mention, since I'm getting my 1-minute sign, before handing it over, is promoting open access to transport data. This is something that obviously Google is already doing, but we've had to build it ourselves, and we have the resources to do so. But we've seen that in those communities where local government or national government has required transportation data to be opened up, that people are building services on top of it, but also that even the businesses that aren't building services are seeing increased efficiency. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to, it seems that what we hear is that data does have a huge economic value, and I would probably pick up on one thing that I've heard from Jaques before, which is a statement that capital will flow no matter what. And I read some statistics, I think it was from Harvard Business School, that analyzed the impact of the e-privacy legislation in Europe. I'm sorry, I'm following the data protection in Brussels, so I keep coming back to this legislation. But this study did show that FDI flow in Europe was impacted by this legislation. In fact, it decreased because of fear of compliance. I think it is really important to try to kind of capture of what is the value that we talk about and what is the economic value of data. So I turn back to you and ask the question of how can we then measure it?
Okay, I spent most of my life last few years as a president of IDC International. IDC means International Data Corporation. This is the main source of data for the ICT industry worldwide. And so, of course, in memory of this legacy, I have just to inflict you one slide with a few numbers. And I have 8 in the background, but you will have them separately. We have no time to go through them. But just will ask me to put in the picture of what's the internet economy for Europe, and this is the result of a report that we've written for the European Commission. It substantially says a few things. So first, the total internet economy, so the total value of goods and services, and they don't measure data, transacted on the internet in Europe is something less than 500 billion euros. It says that Europe is still the largest, not for long, the largest B2C market in the world. It says that the major part of the internet industry is moving, of the ICT industry is moving to become an internet industry, and it will be interesting to discuss the relationship between ICT and digital industry from this standpoint. So is there still a future for the ICT industry? Nice question. And finally, the internet market, so the total amount of the demand is growing 7% more or less. All these data are heavily underscored. And Michael has explained the reason, and I would I couldn't agree more on the basic points of his comments. So I would just focus on a few comments why I believe that in case he's being a little bit too cautious, and I understand this, of course, in our job it's better to be cautious sometimes, in order to avoid to take undue conclusions, but certainly the direction is right. My comments. First of all, Marcus says that the data have a different economic activity beyond products and services, and he remarks that official economic statistics dramatically undercount the growth of data-driven activities. I believe that the reason why probably the impact of the data-driven evolution is going to be bigger is the fact that I have the impression that in the paper of Michael, he focuses mainly on data sets resulting from structured transactions. While most of big data grow in size because they are captured by ubiquitous information sensing mobile devices, remote sensing technologies, software lags, cameras, microphones, wireless sensor networks, petabytes of data that are accumulating fast, a lot faster than transitional transaction-based processes. Would also suggest that what we call big data encompass both what I would call instead, that's my definition, dead data versus live data. I've been working all the life with dead data, so I know what I mean. Dead data that are collected, that are modeled, that then are nicely frozen, put in the refrigerator, and sometimes you get them out and you reuse them. And it's good. It's good to have big data because, of course, you understand what's happening. It's the history. But things are dramatically changing. Live data are those generated by the Internet of Things, by machine-to-machine, by sensors and tools, directly intercepting the demand and the use in real time, as well as by open data from public utility services that are not the result of bureaucratic transactions. I mean, I was talking recently to a researcher at the NHS in the UK. They were telling me they don't use virtually anymore traditional statistical sources. They use, on the opposite, they directly process huge masses of patient data. More and more. Crispy data, freshly squeezed. If this is true, there is one effect, and the effect is inside the enterprises, is the progressive disappearance of the mid-managers in charge of processing data for enabling the executives to make strategic decisions. And this is strongly facilitated by the mobile revolution. The mobile revolution, together with the business analytics techniques, good platforms and stuff like this, the key decision makers can immediately be in charge of the key decision of the company. They don't need all these mismanagers crunching data and so on. Second effect outside the enterprise will be the radical transformation and crisis of the traditional research and statistical ecosystem. Who will be interested, and a bit provocative, in buying expensive, obsolete databases when you will be able to get crispy data in real time to thousands of massive parallel processors and the most advanced BA platforms and technologies? And at a point I will come to the conclusion of this. Secondly, interesting observation by Michael observes that we are increasingly seeing traditional services transformed into data-driven activities. He quotes the case of retail. This process is a general process. It will be accelerated by a new IT paradigm that is dramatically transforming the traditional economic activities, and I'm referring to the cloud computing. Cloud computing is not a technology, it's a metaphor that extends well beyond traditional IT, enabling the economy to achieve a substantial increase in efficiency for the economic system as a whole. Third, about the empirical adjustment to reassess GDP growth. Substantially, he estimates that on an empirical basis, the data consumptions by individual has been rising at an annual rate of 30%, which is ignored by unofficial statistics. As I was saying at the beginning, I understand and appreciate to be cautious, but I believe that there is a risk of significant underestimation of the real dimension of the impact for a couple of reasons. First, as I was saying, number of experts believe that the embedded system, RFID sensor cameras, will grow many times faster than traditional IT devices. And generating petabytes of unstructured signals, a lot more difficult than traditional transactional files to decode, interpret, and process, so huge masses. So the most interesting, the unknown archipelago of the big data. What's interesting is Jaques was absolutely right. It's not trying to minimize the mistake covering your back about the risk of of making mistakes in this area. It's navigating the archipelago looking for the unexpected, because in the unexpected there is the source of the potential competitive advantage, the changing the rules of the play. And the second point is there is an incredible amount of data in the process of being released by public administration all over Europe. UK government, for instance, is becoming one of the leaders in open data, although not so in big data. And this is perhaps due to the fact that the key drivers of open data initiatives are many information transparency, privacy, accessibility. But in UK, they've been involved in very large-scale IT projects in the past. I'm referring to an NHS IT, which could qualify as big data initiatives. And for diverse reasons, these projects met with major difficulties and experienced major budget overruns and delays. And this is why probably the UK is still pretty cautious on embarking in major big data projects now, and they are some of the most advanced. However, the Open Data Initiative will drive the open release of massive, large public data sets, which eventually will require a strategic big data approach from the UK as well as from the other European governments. So what I see, the situation that I see at the moment in Europe is that there are all those governments that have the fashion of the open data. So central and local administration that are rushing to release huge databases, in many cases 80% is pure garbage. And so basically there is this pollution of data in the system that, of course, petabytes and petabytes of stuff. That's navigating the garbage ocean and extracting on the opposite the useful set of information that you can mesh up in order to generate new original value. This is going to enable a new ecosystem to get out of this, and an important source of growth. Even from garbage, you can produce new energy.
Thank you very much. I guess I turn immediately back to Michael because there's a lot of reflection on what you were saying.
I found the presentations on this panel to be just extremely interesting because it seems that everybody's thinking basically in the same direction. That when we're talking about data, we're talking about the need to not just use data for what we were using it before, but we're talking about new ways of using it. We're talking about new ways of organization. We're talking about the shift. I thought that was very interesting. What you talked about was the shift from thinking about data scarcity to data experimentation. I know an awful lot about what the U.S. statistical agencies are doing in terms of the shift from a new way of thinking about data. And the Census Bureau, which is, of course, the biggest producer of data in the U.S. and perhaps the world, is grappling with this question about how you move from a world of data scarcity to a world of exuberant live data. I want to just sort of make one point. One of the studies that we did was on counting the number of jobs in the app economy. Now, this number has been very widely picked up because we just put out a report on app economy jobs by state. It can be generalized to sort of talking about app economy jobs in Europe, and there seems to be a lot of interest in that. But actually, there's kind of a deeper issue, which is that it's really a shift in a different methodology about how you actually consider what's out there. This, rather than using a survey, which is a limited number of data points that is collected expensively by the government each month, it uses looking at help wanted ads, which is data which is generated in the course of doing business by companies and governments. And it's a very large number of data points that change each day, each week. And what you're doing is, it's live data, it's wild data. You're going out there and you're actually sort of saying, I'm extracting information from something that is generated in the course of doing business. It's the wave of the future, because what it does is it enables you to get closer in touch with what's really happening. And if you think about it that way, it becomes essential, not just for statistical agencies, but for businesses and sort of for governments and for organizations. And it creates new jobs as well, because once you've done that, there's a lot more things that you can do with it. And I think that for PPI, part of the message that we try to get across, both in the US and globally, is that data is not, the shift to the data-driven economy is accompanied both by turmoil and growth. And so the more that we can make the case that this is growth that is beneficial, the more that it's going to be possible for people and policymakers to understand that there's two sides to issues. And what's interesting is that the new tools that the data-driven economy enables also is what enables us to make the arguments in favor of the data-driven economy. So it's a little bit of a climbing the ladder. Every step along the way, you create new tools and that enable you to make the arguments that get you to the next stage of the ladder. So I thought that I was very happy to see Jaques' result about, 60 basis points on growth. Well, for this sort of thing, that's kind of it's the same, we're talking about the same orders of magnitude, the same ballpark, which is only going to grow over time. And that's a sort of a very important message that is coming across here.
Thank you very much. I guess I'm going to open the floor for the panelists to see if there's any further reaction, Jaques, Anthony, or Roberto, to what was said.
I really like funny enough, we converge to the same story, which is big data is good. This being said, I think the pragmatism is that there, as I said, are challenges like the digital divide happening, but also this is not something that's going to be easy. As we say, it's a transformation change. It takes time. So remember, Bob Solow was saying, we see internet everywhere, but in the statistics at the ICT revolution. Why? Because it took 7 years from the supply chain of internet to percolate into the economy and get companies to use it to their own benefits. Big data, as I said, will be the same. So the fact that today growth is not necessarily that strong could be a reflection that we have been successful, but also that we are in the premise of first investment that will reap return in a few years' time. And the second message I want to say is that big data is good, don't be scared. It will possibly take a few years to get the potential. But there is a twist, and a second message I want to convey as well is that we talk a lot about one matrix possibly, a growth of companies or growth in terms of basis point in the GDP. GDP is a measure of activity. GDP is not a measure of wellness. And the wellness, obviously, is driven by, are we distributing this as well to the consumers? And here's the good news. At least my good news is still an hypothesis at this stage, but I'm pretty sure that what the internet and the digital capital and big data is doing is actually transferring, despite all the claims about privacy, which is a concern that should be tackled, we see obviously a transfer in terms of consumer surplus. And here are three reasons or three statistics why I believe so. First of all, if you look at the consumer decision-making journey, you're going to buy tomorrow, you're going to change your internet subscribers, you're going to buy a new mobile phone, you're going to go to the grocery and buy some food. In fact, when people move into digital, in the digital economy, roughly 50 to 60% of the digital touch points that you will have are no longer in the hand of companies, i.e., it's about search, it's about social media, it's about price comparison, everything which is much more C2C, but no longer in the control of the companies. If you compare the offline journey, pretty much the reversal is true. 70% is in the control of the companies. You need to go to a store, and then you have to interface. So the control point is changing from the companies to the consumer. And obviously, when the consumer is king, he can decide, he can take revenge, he can comment badly or positively, and the like. First observation. Second observation, what is the internet? If you look back at the numbers there, on the economy, is pretty much understated. Why? Because advertising, it's actually an expense. You don't see it in the GDP. But the advertising-based economy on the internet has been the funding model of Google and so on. But to the point of today, where people tell you, I cannot live without a search engine. I cannot necessarily get rid of my 100 conversation I do every month with my friends on Facebook. And that obviously is consumer surplus. So the point I want to make is that we need to basically put the debate across not only the GDP and what is missing in the GDP, we need to look at what is it for every constituencies, whether it's government, whether it's companies, whether it's FDI and capital, but also about the consumers. And the good news is that if we start to put that all together, I think the story is still a positive story with all the challenge of privacy and the like, but with positive externalities. And when there is positive externalities, the rule of the game is be careful in making statement of regulation or whatever else. Let's make sure these things live, then we can do things, but let's make sure in the first place that it takes growth.
Because we are in Europe, I have to though challenge you on one point, which is I do accept the benefits of a big data. I mean, I've seen many research of how data can be reused and kind of figure out secondary effect of medication just by crunching search data. But on the other hand, from a European perspective, where we are concerned about what's going on with my information, who is collecting my information, who has access to my information. And I think data has a huge economic value for companies, but on the other hand, I think what Europe is trying to do is to still protect the user who doesn't understand what's going on, they've never heard about the concept of big database, and just feeling kind of losing control of what's happening with their data. So I wonder whether there is, and maybe I kind of open up a little bit the floor to the other panelists, especially that I see other companies, HP, Microsoft, GSMA, a little bit of how could we, is there a way to kind of benefit big data and get the economic value of the data while somehow putting back the consumer in the center of this debate and somehow allowing the consumer to be part of these economic benefits and not just companies getting all the gains, but also consumers feeling that they are in charge again and get the economic benefit.
I just want to, I think it's important when we think about this question to think in terms of the demographic divide between young and old, because we have in both the US and Europe very high youth unemployment rates, very high. We also have very high youth benefits from data. So I think when we think in terms of who's winning, who's losing, who has something to gain from the data-driven economy and who's worried about privacy, it's important to think about the age angle as well. I know that we have Diana Crew sitting in the audience here, who's one of the PPI, why don't you wave, Diana, who's one of the PPI economists who's looked a lot at what's been happening to youth in America in terms of being squeezed. Because I think once you think about this question in terms of age, you actually get a different answer, okay? I know that my parents probably are quite scared of having their data out on the internet, all right? But my parents are also not one of the young and unemployed. And I think that if you posed a question to sort of young people, both in the U.S. and Europe, is, are you prepared to give up a little bit of your control of your data for sort of faster growth and, incidentally, access to all the online tools that you use all the time? You might get a different answer than you would asking a different group of people demographically. And from this point of view, it's both a governance issue and a growth issue and a future issue.
I guess just 1 second in reaction is that I think my question is, do we have to give up a bit of control of our data? Or is there a way we can kind of work around it and give back the control while we still?
Yeah, just for the record, I'm not saying that it's about privacy. What I'm saying is that there are benefits, and the full-fledged benefit needs to be first computed, at least that everybody is transparent and conscious about what's the value at stake. Whatever research you will do, you can ask me, you can ask everybody else from a privacy point of view. It's normal. 70 to 80% of the people will say they are concerned. This is not the right question. The question is that what's the value trade-off? And there are just a lot of things you can do with data that even anonymized give you a lot. I wrote a paper on nowcasting based on a Google methodology using Google search to predict car sales. I'm using search every day to find information. There is value, and I don't need to get information about the people. The law of large number gives me enough of information. So the point I want to make is that it's a question really of making sure we understand what we're talking about with the right definition. And I urge everyone to make sure that we've got a way to measure value and cost and see what's the value at stake before taking debates about, usage, non-usage, what is allowed, not used, what is open. I'm not in a prescription game, and obviously that's not my role. But I think let's make sure we understand what's the value at stake. We can kill a golden goose, but obviously you need to kill the devil as well. That I agree.
Line from Microsoft.
Yeah, great, thanks. So a couple different things to respond to Rita's question about, is it all just about, the growth, the economic growth? And we absolutely don't think that that's the case in any use of data, and we absolutely agree with all the speakers this morning that there's a lot of good to be gained from analytics. in terms of big data analytics, both from the perspective of operational efficiency, new product services, but also social economic good. However, we strongly believe that that really needs to be balanced against the protection against risk and harms of the individual. What's really missing in the conversation thus far is that there's a lack of trust. If you look at the approach in the data protection in the EU, it's very much about mandating trust via regulations to make sure that personal risk and harms are really the people are actually being protected from risk and harms. I think in the conversation of this morning, we do need to bring up the notion of how do you actually build out a balanced ecosystem? What are the principles that really need to be in place to enable that trusted and permission-based data exchanges? So we've done a fair amount of work just to make sure that the conversation is balanced in both ways. Another thing, I just wanted to go back to something that Michael mentioned, which is there seems to be a digital divide and differences in terms of privacy attitudes. And we would say that, no, we've done a fair amount of research from Dana Boyd in particular that says that there is really no difference in terms of privacy attitudes. We use the term data management, right? The permission towards accessing and the use of data. Young people have parameters in terms of how they define who would have access to the flow and use of their data. They just define it differently. But if you go across the board and take a look at how do you define the context that defines sensitivity of people to use, it's the same set of parameters. The parameters, how those parameters are measured are different, but that level of sensitivity exists as well.
Okay, I guess Pietro was first.
Yes, I don't want to talk about data. I don't want to talk about data protection because that goes to my second panel. But I rather want to connect to link to what Jaques was saying before about the economy. And if we talk about Europe, let's start about Italy. The average number of employees per company is 4. So we think about 4 people. Usually it's mother, father, and the 2 kids. It's usually. It's average. This is a figure by the Italian government, so it's not a number made up. So 4 people, usually a family, running a company, and the average in Europe is not higher. It's 9 people per company. So we're talking about Microsoft and Google, giants, but then we have to go down to Europe where we have 4 people, or Italy, or 9. It doesn't matter. And I'm wondering how we can facilitate these people, these folk, to use big data and to use big data into their business. This is, to me, the first issue that needs to be addressed. The second issue goes to regulation, and that explains, and this is probably a longer ideological discussion, but it explains why we have here Microsoft and Google, and then we can have Facebook and many other companies, and we don't have Microsoft, Google, Facebook that are European companies. That's another big issue. You know, and when you tell this to the Commission tells, yes, we will do it, but actually, if I read what Nelly Kroes is going to say today, is online privacy protection is weak. So this is for the next panel. And then I'm wondering, in terms of Facebook is 1 billion people, that means at least 1 billion data. Okay, so is how we make sure that, you know, the European economy, and, you know, American could say, who cares about the European economy? We mainly care about the American economy. But for European, we say, we care about the European economy, we care about the American economy, we care about today the developing countries' economy, is how we make sure that this big data and this digital divide, I think that's it's a beautiful statement, how we make sure that the 4 people get enough skills to use this data. I'm sure Microsoft will work out some tools, or Google as well, some tools for analytically use this information and make sure that even small enterprises will do that. I hope it will not take 7 years, as was said before, but I guess this is a challenge that we need to address as well, because too often, and Rita can confirm, in Brussels we talk about big data referring to big companies, but then the 75% of Italian GDP, and not wellness, GDP, comes from small enterprises. And so it's how do we facilitate the use of big data by these companies?
Thank you. Please, Pat.
I just want to address a couple of things, if I could, from Michael and Jaques. I don't think the generational divide, is as sharp as you believe. I mean, you know, forget the color of my hair, I'm really 18 inside. My concerns are just as sharp as others. And, you know, we do research, Microsoft does research, others do research that shows that those divides are not as sharp as some would believe. I think, you know, I agree with Carolyn. What's key here is transparency and trust and choice and control. Absolutely, you can have as much big data as you want. I mean, mobile operators connect 6 billion users around the world. How big is that? And you need trust and confidence control. And what's interesting in the UK, and Google are a part of this initiative, you have an initiative called My Data, which is trying to turn data from utilities, from mobile operators, from others, into a way in which empowers consumers to learn and understand from their behaviors. What is it? They've said that they can gain insight into their own behaviors and make more informed decisions. It also provides opportunities and goods that they otherwise wouldn't have. And in terms to Pietro, it's going to be an interesting debate next, I think, because I don't believe that online privacy laws are weak. I think it's the enforcement that is weak. Yeah, I know, but we've had the Article 29 Working Party say that computers in Europe, mobile devices in Europe, are subject to European law, where a company overseas places information on blah blah blah. But I've not seen one piece of enforcement yet.
Take 1 second about the demographic divide. When I meant the demographic divide, I didn't just mean attitudes towards data. I meant that young people, both in Europe and the US, have a much higher unemployment rate. Okay, so for them, the creation of jobs has a high, if we can put, has a high policy salience. Okay, and so if you ask the question, okay, regulation versus growth, you might get a different answer.
Thank you. I just do a time check with Will. We are over 10:30. Can I have still 5 to 10 minutes for question from the audience? Or
yes, and
two?
there's still a reason not to get in, but 10,
Okay.
10 minutes.
Okay, just can you raise the hand if you have any question? One question? Okay, so Morris.
Right over there.
Okay.
Okay, well, I'll try to be brief. I noticed, Michael, the Business Week I'd noticed became much less interesting to me about 2 years ago. Seriously, I thought it was just the Bloomberg takeover, but now I realize it was when you stopped writing. You've talked quite a lot about the creation aspect, both you and Jaques, in the industry. You know, if you go back about 100 years or so, we were talking a lot, our ancestors were talking a lot about the creation of the automobile industry. And nobody was talking about the destruction of the horse industry or the associated fertilizer industry. What do the two of you think about what is being destroyed in our process of creative destruction?
Before you answer, can I collect the questions from the floor, and then I'm going to give back the floor to all my panelists. Okay, thank you.
In the spirit of pragmatic evidence, I have quick check-back fact questions.
Can I ask you to introduce yourself?
Stefan Richter with The Globalist. Michael talked about 44% job growth. What's the basis, not of how you forecast the growth, but the basis of the 44%? I would think, since you didn't mention it, it's a rather small overall number. Anthony talked about, if I heard it correctly, 140 billion in savings. Is that a one-time effect, or is that something that continues? Jaques, because if it's a one-time effect, it's not such a big number. It just sounds big. Jaques had a very interesting question where he said, is all of this just going to lead to redistribution of market share, or is it actually going to develop some economic activity? I mean, 60 basis points written forward on a continuous basis can be large, but I think there was a large element of honesty in his question, but he never answered it, so I'd like to give him an opportunity for that. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other question from the audience? Okay, so what I'm going to do, one more question?
Well, I have a comment after you're all finished, so I thought it wasn't fair to ask a question, but I will make a comment, if I may, after you're finished.
Would you like to make it now, or?
Well, that will ruin all the discussion. Well, no, I just had a whole series of things that I wanted to talk about relating to some of the issues that were raised. I'm Megan Richards from the European Commission, the bad one. No, I think there are a number of things. It's a very interesting discussion, of course, but I think we have to clearly distinguish between personal data, public data, data that can be aggregated and remove the personal aspect from it, data that's generated by industry and is owned by that industry, public sector data, et cetera. And a number of you have mentioned various of these aspects. And I think it's very important to make a clear distinction between these different aspects and what the potential is for them. Just as an example, in the area of public sector information, the Commission has been revising the Public Sector Information Directive, encouraging greater and better use of public sector information. One of the things that I'm sure most of the panelists know is that just putting the public sector data out there is not sufficient. You also have to make it interoperable, you have to make it in a form that can be used, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it sounds nice to say, yes, let's make public sector information available, but it has to be in a usable form. So, I mean, all these things, like everything in the world, are always a bit more complex than they seem superficially. But just as an example, too, we see also the great potential of use just of public sector information by SMEs. There are all sorts of small companies that we see using public data that's made available, let's say meteorological data, to develop new apps, for example. So someone said that big data is only for big companies, and it's not. So that's one. I have many other comments, but you'll hear from me later, I'm sure.
Thank you. So I'm going to just give back the floor to my panelists, and starting maybe from left and going towards the right, Anthony.
Great. The 140, 180 billion euros was annually, but I don't have a footnote in my speaking notes. I will find it and I will give it to you for the citation. I thought the last comment was very interesting. I totally agree that it's more complex than it seems at first, but one of the ways that Google kind of approaches things is, let's not try to boil the ocean, let's just get a few things right, and then when those are right, we can highlight those as successes and more people can emulate them. So rather than trying to ensure that every single public organization is releasing all of its public data in an open and interoperable way and prescribing that from the top down, I would rather empower individual public authorities to do so and then spread it. But obviously, you can go from both directions as well. Without wanting to steal the thunder of the next panel, I do think that you were right about in your comment about distinguishing between public data, personal data. But sometimes it gets a bit more complicated than that. Our measurement lab is a good example. In order for researchers to be able to assess the robustness of the network, we need the originating IP address to be intact in that database so that people can actually see where a signal was coming from and going to. Whether that IP address is personal data is a matter on which we disagree rather vocally with the Article 29 Working Party. And especially in the world of big data, and some of the other panelists will probably know this better than I do, knowing where that line falls between what is personal data and what is not can be quite difficult.
Yeah, I had pretty much three questions, well, two questions and statements I will try to synthesize. I will combine Maurice and your point. Our first analysis, again, on a sample of something like actually much more small medium enterprise in the use of big data. For what it was, it's 6 countries, something like 10,000 companies. What we discover is 70% of the effect of big data is actually reallocation due to competition. Which obviously means added value because the best always have better added value, and 30% is actually externalities. But again, it depends on the countries, it depends on the industry and so on. So there is a reallocation mechanism. Call it digital Darwinism in one way, but at the end of the day, yes, there is going to be some allocation. The second comment was, I really like the comment of data because, again, the taxonomy of data is today, again, not well done. And my statement was, again, about privacy. It's a fundamental debate. Let's not try to say it's not. But it's, again, about a narrow lens of what we talk about here, and it's usually a misleading lens. Let me explain that. As I said, the public data today is actually much more useful, believe it or not, at least with my experience with companies, than personal data. Most of the companies, by the way, have a lot of personal CRM data they cannot handle with, let alone the fact that they've got allowance to use it. They cannot use it. Actually, it's much easier for me to use public data and help them to do things than using their own private data, because most of the time, the data field and everything is not even well structured. And the second reason why it's more important to get public data, because they are real-time. They are real-time data. The definition of it's not about big, it's about value. And the value of data, when they are real-time, it's much more powerful because you can do nowcasts, you can do a lot of things. Second observation about data, it's not about the stock, as I say, it's about the real element to it, but it depends really by sectors. If you are in the retail industry, the more potential data is not to make sure when you go into a store that you get the right products. Nobody cares about that. It's going to be a voucher or something like that. It's about RFID that allows you to anticipate whether your stock inventory goes down, yes or no, so you can basically optimize your stock. And optimizing your stock in retail is 4% of margin in the end of the year, or 50% more of profitability. So it's not about personal data. It's about aggregated data about what people buy that can feed into the stock inventory, which is important. So every industry will have different value drivers of big data. I encourage you to read the report of McKinsey, at the McKinsey Global Institute, of the value of big data. We try to create the taxonomy and show that, which is careful. Let's not necessarily go into one topic of high substance, that we should all recognize about privacy. What we talk about where the value lies and how it's going to be used is usually not necessarily the thing that we anticipate. Third thing about data, again, a classical example. The best data are not data that you capture and you use worse, we abuse. It's the data that you create. Typical example, working for one of my clients as a cable company, every week, we basically launch a very quick market research where people don't have to, they opt in, they decide to basically give us information, and we crowdsource about customer service, about next products, about how to do best installation and the like. The staggering fact, because this company has one of the biggest market share today in cable, it's because customers give them a lot of insight. The prediction that we do on a monthly basis by using this data given by trusted customers, so it's a question of trust, much more than anything else, it's 99% prediction rate. Any other markets research would come 2 months late, and the prediction of that market research to sales is less than 50%. So again, it's what data, what taxonomy, and it's quite key to have that debate, because at the end of the day, big data could be noise. And the question is that the noise for somebody could be the big data of somebody else. And so the question is that let's define that correctly, and let's make sure that we go to that level of granularity and taxonomy, because otherwise we can miss the boat.
Thank you. And for the final words of Michael and Roberto.
All right. Let me just say just a couple of things. One is about automobiles. Okay, when I think about the analogy to automobiles, I don't think about the destruction of the horse industry. I think about building roads out to rural areas. You build a road out to a rural area, a paved road, and what you've done is you've done a couple of things. You've perhaps destroyed the privacy of the people who used to live there. You've changed the nature of the rural area. There's no doubt about it. That's a real change. At the same time, you've opened up a new area to economic development, and you've raised incomes. And you've created the possibility for people to live in areas they couldn't live before the development of suburbs. Now, we all know that this process of connecting rural areas to the rest of the economy is something that people have mixed feelings about, very real mixed feelings. And that's a little bit what we're grappling with here in terms of the data-driven economy. In terms of the number, okay, BLS categories are not great. The number that I like to when I look at over time is that 500,000 plus app economy jobs today, 0 in 2007, 500,000 growth at a time when that overall jobs were shrinking both in the US and Europe.
Roberto, final word is yours.
Okay. First of all, I will refer to the question of Mr. Paganini about the industrial structure and how big data could help the SMEs. And but I will widen the picture. And sorry, Jaques, this is a BCG slide. And however, in this intellectual community is not relevant. What's interesting is that what's happening really is that the world is changing in the sense that you see here 5 clusters of nations. And you have, what's interesting is that what's happening is that I believe that the data-driven evolution is driving really a redefinition of the world in terms of the capacity of taking advantage of it. So the digital picture is changing in the sense that you have all those native digital countries that are leapfrogging, moving directly to use new, not just new technology, but new business models that are extremely more dynamic than all the other ones. And you have then the players, the nascent natives, that are substantially those that are structuring themselves on this basis, and the aspirants that are the emerging markets that are moving in this direction. And so substantially, you're going to see a dramatic change. Inside this, talking about Europe, Europe is, Italy, Germany, and so on, widely, in particular, are dominated by the presence of small and medium enterprises. Certainly, the issue is how to take advantage of this. And I believe that I was saying before, the IT paradigm, the IT paradigm of cloud is changing things. So we need to intensively, at the EU level, we need absolutely to invest into having more structured, shared infrastructures from this standpoint, facilitate the development of infrastructures, enabling to get out of the slavery of the silos and of the systems owned by the single companies that are just replicating useless cost and taking advantage and taking away resources to the real development. If small and medium enterprises can take advantages of the best databases with the best BA platforms that are available on demand, well, the situation is going to change dramatically. But most of the revenues are coming in these economies, while there is a huge number of small and medium enterprises, by mid-size companies that are already fully part of the international supply chains, very dynamic, absolutely international companies that are making more than 2 or 3% of their local markets. From this standpoint, I believe that these are those who are going to take even more advantage from the availability. And at this point, there is the issue. It says, okay, how can these companies, the most dynamic companies, take advantage of the data-driven evolution of the big data in particular? And so from this standpoint, the issue is, certainly, if everybody could access to the best databases with the best BA platforms, at the end of the day, everybody will be on the same ground. So what does make the difference? I believe that Jaques has the answer. From this standpoint, the issue is, what's the best combination of the digital capital inside those companies enabling a competitive advantage? And I believe that the capability of navigating the archipelago of the unknown in the big data enables you to find the spot, exploring, that's the right paradigm, in order to get a competitive advantage. So management becomes a form of art supported by, how to say, new artistic tools enabling you to identify the islands of the unknown in the archipelago of the big data. That's a little bit how I see it. And finally, no, just I don't want to invade the issue of the protectionism. I just hate the concept of, privacy protection, because if there is one thing that Europe doesn't need is further protectionism. We need to defragment Europe from protectionism. So from this standpoint, I believe that at the end of the day, before the invention of the photography, it was impossible to get an image of myself or as public. Having an image of myself public is a fact of life. Defending my privacy depends on myself, so on what I want to make available information about myself or not. All the rest is public, period.
Thank you very much for all my speakers. I guess this is a perfect closing sentence of whether we should and how we could get Europe out of this protectionist mechanism. And a question will, do we have a coffee break now? Or?
Yes, let's take 10 minutes, please. We've got to get back on track. Let's take a break. Very interesting stuff here. Yeah, thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, everyone.